Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchen, and I'm the Director of IALS. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to another of our online seminars. Our guest today is Professor Shauna Van Prague of the Faculty of Law, McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Shauna's substantive areas of research and expertise are primarily children in law, religion in law, legal education, and the private law of civil wrongs. Within each area, she adopts a methodological approach grounded in legal pluralism, a sensibility to identity-based narrative and critique, and a particular emphasis on literary sources and style. Today's seminar, entitled Legal Education and the Pandemic, Presence, Proximity, and Pedagogy, is grounded in Shauna's experience of teaching a legal education course at McGill, and is the initiator of a collection of pandemic-related essays by legal academics across Canada, entitled Law and Learning in the Time of Pandemic, a Collage. Clearly, this work is incredibly timely and serves the hugely important aim of providing a history and theory of the present in legal education. We are very grateful to Shauna for joining us today from Montreal. Our format is as follows. Throughout Shauna's presentation, our audience members may raise questions and comments in the Q&A function. After the presentation, I will attempt to moderate the questions and comments from you, and you can continue to use the Q&A function to make new interventions. And now, I'd like to welcome Shauna to our remote platform at the Institute, and it's over to you, Shauna.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's really a delight and an honor to be here with you. I wish I could be in London. As you see, I have brought the beautiful fall foliage of Montreal with me behind me so that I can share where I am and imagine being where Carl is, I know, and where at least some of you are in London. And thank you to the Institute, and I gather to Dali Sarkos for her organizational and technical support for making these seminars run smoothly. And I look forward to the exchange with all of you via Carl at the end of my remarks. So I'm going to share with you reflections, images, suggestions, ideas grounded in the particular context that we're all living in, and in some of my own projects and experience and observations over the 7.5, almost 8 months that we have been engaged in legal education within the context of the pandemic. And to do so, I'm going to actually structure my remarks around 3 sets of words. I will remind you of the words, and they aren't hard to remember because I've used alliteration for each set of words. So I have 3 D words: disruption, distraction, and direction. 3 R words: resistance, reflection, and recreation. And 3 C words: courage, curiosity, and clarity. And I will throw in some more D's and R's and C's as we go along. And I'm going to use these words all around a metaphor, an image of a speed bump. Now, why a speed bump? Because like most of you, I shifted my principal working area to home in the spring. It was still kind of late winter here in Montreal of 2020. And my home desk is situated in the front window of my house. And in early April, just between the kind of melting gray snow and the first crocuses, a team of workers turned up outside my window in the street to start installing a speed bump. This was a moment of great excitement in the neighborhood. You can imagine how we were starving for something to watch, something to do. And so everybody was out watching as team after team came along, task after task was undertaken, and the whole construction of the speed bump went over a number of days, and indeed I thought immediately of it as a metaphor for the pandemic and started thinking about legal education as I watched the speed bump, and was thrilled that neighbors down the street actually got out with their camera day after day and took pictures of the speed bump. So I'm going to actually use some of those pictures as backgrounds as I talk about these about 3 stages of the speed bump. And at each stage, I will offer an observation, a D word, a reaction, an R word, and what I hope is a little bit of an insight, a C word. Okay, so I will move to my first shift in background. So here you see the first stage, a stage that I will call initiation of the speed bump. And here this huge truck appeared unannounced, unanticipated, a dramatic change in the landscape of the neighborhood at the start of April. So the observation is clearly disruption. That's the D word for the observation. A heavy, loud, strange, as I say, uninvited arrival in our shared space, disrupting our line of vision, impossible to avoid or escape. So what kind of reaction? I would suggest resistance. Now, with respect to the actual speed bump in the street, I don't think anyone resisted the idea of a speed bump slowing down the traffic. After all, there are 3 schools in close vicinity. But resistance might consist of kind of the equivalent of putting in earplugs or headphones or temporarily moving our workspace. Definitely, right, having to figure out how to get around, park the car on a different street, and shift, right, our trajectory because the street was closed for the construction of the speed bump. Now, with respect to the pandemic speed bump in legal education, I want to talk briefly about resistance, what I mean by resistance to what I think was in some ways and in some institutions, a too easy and too fast transformation to the idea of an online legal education. So shifting to online mode without really understanding the implications of what it meant to shift online. So why resistance? It would be silly of me to suggest that my call for resistance is equivalent to kind of burying our heads in the sand and kind of going into denial, right? And neither do I mean by resistance that it wasn't a good thing that teaching and learning in law could indeed adjust well enough, right, to finish off the 2019-2020 academic year, and perhaps even better than well enough as we shifted into the 2020-2021 academic year. But at the time, back in April, as the pandemic speed bump equipment kind of blocked the vision, right, took up all of the space, I immediately started thinking about resistance, constructive resistance, a willingness to adjust enough while insisting on the essential character of the sharing of physical campus space in legal education, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. And the learning at a distance became necessary, in other words, but I don't know that it was necessary to accept that, right, we were going to kind of shift into true online legal education. So I'm going to intersperse in my comments some little quotes from some of my colleagues across Canada who did indeed write these essays of reflection for this collage that will be is forthcoming, will be published in the next couple of weeks in an online journal called Lex Electronica at University of Montreal. So here's a colleague from Saskatchewan. In what is an expected act, he says, I attended over the last 2 weeks remotely delivered sessions about remote teaching offered by my university's Teaching and Learning Center. A consistent message was the preferability of asynchronous learning. That message was delivered through sessions presented synchronously, with the synchronous format presumably chosen and preferred for some reason, some unspoken reason, right, about the preferability, as he says, of shared time if we can't have shared space. I think this was also a time where we saw resistance to top-down emergency mode decision-making. Here's another colleague, quite pessimistic about and unhappy, as you will hear in his tone. People are often seduced into giving up on collective action and mutual aid by declarations of emergency. Times are difficult, time is of the essence, there's no time to deliberate, there's no time to think. As I concluded this essay in the spring of 2020, the university where I then worked remained closed until further notice. The same might be said of our collegium. So, right, a kind of resistance to what was perceived by some members of the academy as a kind of shift into emergency mode without the kind of deliberative and collective governance mechanisms that we hoped were securely in place at the university. So these are some modes of what I mean by constructive questioning, constructive resistance. I think, though, at the same time, there was resistance in the form of emotion and sadness, right? And I think that that was important to allow for that and to listen to how it felt for people to be kind of yanked out of their usual kind of mode of teaching and learning, not just because people don't like change, right? But because people were genuinely sorry without really being able to articulate exactly why, but genuinely sorry not to be seeing each other, sharing with each other in the shared spaces of the university. So all of that, I think, underscores, for me anyway, the importance right away, early on, at the first stage, if you like, of the pandemic speed bump, of articulating what it is we missed, why we felt the loss of something very precious. And I'll come back to that in my remarks. The insight, I think, at this first stage, this stage of disruption, constructive resistance, is the need for courage, my C word. The actual speed bump on the street required some patience. I don't know if that was real courage, but it required some patience, right, as the speed bump took form. And the reaction to the pandemic in general in the early days also called out to people for courage, right, for patience, for kind of digging in for the long haul. In Quebec and in Montreal in particular, people put pictures of rainbows on their front doors and windows with the message, "Ça va bien aller," it'll be okay. And there was a kind of sense of collective courage in the face of adversity. A reaching out, a sharing of the experience, right, with our literal neighbors. As we found paths, as I mentioned before, through a temporary detours, right? Just as the road was closed, so people had to take a detour, there was a sense in which, okay, lots of things are closed off to us at this moment. We will have to find a detour for now. And that finding the detour required and relied on real connection, another C word. And we all found that we had modes of connection that we were used to, connection with our students, connection with our colleagues in Legal Academy, whether in-person connections, using the phone, traveling to other places, right? And we had to add others, especially vis-a-vis our students. So another colleague, this one, Dalhousie, writes the following. I remember feeling a sense of care, concern, and affection for my students. I do feel this way towards them generally, but however dishonorable, I confess that sometimes these feelings are less at the forefront, and my teaching is animated more by a sense of having to get it done. But in these moments, she's talking about March and early April, I felt less that the students are part of my job and more like they were part of my life and I part of theirs. I felt responsible for them and for their well-being. These feelings did not arise logically or through my own thinking. They just came, sometimes as a flood, and they brought with them a tangible peace and genuine gratitude for my position as someone's teacher. So this first stage, right, as the big truck appears, right, we see this first set of changes to the landscape of legal education. Lots of checking in, commiserating, detailed communication, whether with colleagues or top down from the administration to all of us, with sometimes the details not bringing as much information as we would have liked, right? A sense of brokenness. One student wrote to me saying, I just feel it's so sad that we won't be able to come back into the classroom and finish the course as we anticipated. We also, you might recall, experienced a kind of imposed busyness, a shift in the distribution of priorities and resources. So not only was the view filled with unfamiliar equipment, but we all had to figure out very quickly how to use the equipment, right? It wasn't just looking at the truck, it was actually being handed the keys and told you're going to have to learn how to drive this truck, at least around the block, by next week. And I remember at my first meeting of the ad hoc remote pedagogy committee that our dean set up and put me on this spring, I remember coming to that first meeting feeling, okay, we are all going to have to roll up our sleeves and do a whole lot of work, a lot of detail, drafting guidelines, drafting a toolkit. But I said right at the beginning, we should take all of this on with a kind of attitude, as I've already suggested, of constructive resistance, of pushing ourselves to think constantly of what it is we are kind of not only not experiencing, but what it is we are truly missing. The risk at the time, I think, was that not much space was made for articulating what it was we were sad about, what was so precious about pre-speed bump teaching and learning in law. Educational institutions followed the directions for the detour, but often with little by way of clear insistence on the essential service that education, particularly public post-secondary education, offers. And here I just invite you to think about the messages at the time from your own institutions. How did those institutions articulate their priorities? I was quite disappointed by some messages from post-secondary institutions that kept insisting that the top priority was safety at all costs, rather than reiterating our top priority is quality teaching, learning, and research within the constraints imposed by the pandemic. And so I think that challenge, of trying to articulate what we were sad about, what we were missing, takes on a unique character in legal education. It seemed to me, and again, you will get a better sense of what I mean through my remarks, particularly at the next two stages. But I'll just finish off this first stage, my stage of disruption, resistance, and courage, that it seemed to me that particularly in terms of thinking about meaningful legal education, that the distance and the absence that we were experiencing should have pushed us, and continues, I think, to push us to think about the centrality of their opposites, presence as opposed to absence, and proximity as opposed to distance. That is, usually law students, when they look back at their legal education, they don't simply say, I learned contracts, torts, criminal law, admin law, etc. they say, I took contracts with Professor X, or I learned about criminal law from Professor Y. There's a really interesting proximity, I think, in much of legal education, I hope, and I think this is a character in particular of North American legal education, where people talk about my prof and profs talk about my students. There's this necessary kind of proximity that is largely played out in, but we are noticing doesn't have to be completely played out in conditions of actual literal presence, right? That we build our academic communities around actual spaces. People talk about how they went to X school or Y school, right? They have this kind of allegiance. They think about their own legal education, and we as teachers in law think about the ways in which we teach and the ways in which we connect with our students as linked to the unique character of the particular institutions to which we're affiliated. As I say, I'll come back to those ideas of proximity and presence, but I did think that even at that very first disruptive stage, it was important to not simply to be sad about how things weren't the same as always, but to really push ourselves early on to think about what it was that was so precious. So let me switch now. I've said enough about this first stage, probably too much. Let me switch to the second stage, the stage that I call smoothing down the speed bump and fixing it in place. So here you see a different smaller truck coming to smooth over the gravel and fix the speed bump in place. And if I move my head, you can kind of see behind me the back of a child kind of standing on the sidewalk watching this in what I call my D word here. The observation of this stage is distraction. So we can't help, right? As this little truck came along to smooth down the speed bump, arguably the people on the street can't help but stop and stare, right? That the road that had been blocked off, of course, became, in a sense, a viewing gallery, a place for people to come and watch these different stages, become observers of something that was indeed kind of being fixed into place, becoming part of the furniture. This was a shared focal point for everyone living with the road work outside their windows or passing by. And as I say, a kind of welcome spectacle at a time of confinement, particularly for children who had no school, and a way to take our attention off the constant reporting of grim statistics about the coronavirus. So from distraction, I want to talk about the reaction of reflection. A reflexive and reflection-filled mode, and how this second stage called for, I think, a more subtle and fine-grained adjustment to the shifting landscape of legal education. This stage, the smoothing down the speed bump, fixing it in place, was less about shock, right, of the big truck arriving and dumping stuff, and more about adjustment. And so I think members of the Legal Academy took on all kinds of projects over the late spring, summer, into the fall that were, right, in a sense, tied to their new identity as observers of the speed bump being smoothed into place. So my particular project that I came up with in April was this call for short papers in any kind of mode or format by colleagues across the country. So that was a way to kind of immerse myself rather than being in resistance mode, right? Immerse myself, but to call for reflection on kind of the meaning and the experience of going through this. Many members of the Legal Academy, I think, started to think about connections between the pandemic and their substantive research and writing and teaching issues. Many people, of course, had to shift into pedagogical reflection mode as they either participated in the creation of guidelines and teaching tools or read the guidelines and teaching tools and thought about how they would be incorporated into their teaching. And this brings me to yet another project in reflexive but also instrumental mode for many of us, and that was redesigning foundational courses that we were going to be teaching, paying attention not so much to the content, right? Realizing that teaching, that the content part was easy, that particularly if it was a foundational course, I'm thinking here of my first year torts course, foundational course that I've taught for many, many years, I didn't spend a minute worrying about the content for this coming year, but a whole lot of time thinking about shape and mix of components and how to engage first year students. And I'll speak just very briefly here about, and then I'm going to talk about this a little bit more about this second stage, that I think there was a door opened for many of us to play a little bit, right, with what we could do with our teaching. In my first year course, I decided to implement something that I'd been thinking about for a few years, and that was a Harry Potter theme for my first year students, bringing in examples from Harry Potter to illustrate how even in the magical world, right, there's a whole legal system about interactions, harms, needs to apologize, ways to compensate, etc. But also, so there was a kind of lightness to this because Harry Potter, as it turns out, kind of is known well by most new law students at this point. And so this was a way for them to feel, I hoped, to feel like they had some expertise already as they came into this very strange and difficult kind of world of learning remotely. But I also had a pedagogical purpose in bringing in Harry Potter, and that was that it allowed me to divide up a large class into 4 houses and to use the Zoom structure to interact with 15 people, roughly 60 students, 15 people at a time, which I thought was about how the number that I could really interact with through a class, while the others kind of for that class step back into their little black boxes, but at least are watching and imagining that kind of dynamic interaction. So I thought that this was a good example of how to kind of redesign, reflect on structure of teaching and how to hold on to the valuable interaction in a first year law classroom, even when teaching on Zoom. So that's just an example, but it brings me to my C word, my insight at this second stage. My C word, I don't know that anybody remembers anymore, but was curiosity for this second stage. And I would combine it actually with creativity, but initially curiosity. So the speed bump, the actual speed bump in my street became briefly, before the road opened again, a place to play, to take risks, to shift from the curious observers that you see behind me here, right, to creative and active participants. So it was just fascinating to watch from my window as teenagers turned up with their skateboards and then took pictures of each other doing these kind of crazy things on the speed bump. As a preschooler with her father walking on the sidewalk pulled her dad into the middle of the street, which of course he allowed because there weren't any cars. And then together, right, because they had daringly left the safety of the sidewalk, they kind of stomped on the speed bump as just with sheer joy. Mothers pushing baby carriages decided to try it, in the middle of the street over the speed bump. People riding their bicycles took their hands off the handlebars as they went down the middle of the road over the speed bump. So there was this real playfulness, this a shift, as I say, from curiosity to creativity. Now you can't really tell behind me this little this little back of a head. But this is the back of a head of a Hasidic Jewish boy in the neighborhood. So my neighborhood is heavily Orthodox, and it was particularly fascinating to watch these boys who were observing, right, to return in the afternoon with their sisters. Usually the girls and boys would be separated in their play, and in school they'd be at separate schools, but here they were together on the speed bump, trying out their scooters and their roller skates. And so I thought that there was an interesting message there, right, that even the most conservative or orthodox users of our shared space in the academy, right, were invited to be turn themselves into risk takers, to kind of transform themselves on this speed bump. So before I shift to the third stage, the third and final stage, I want to push this idea of playfulness in the academy a little bit more, using the inspiration of the actual speed bump in the street becoming, if you will, a kind of temporary playground when all the playgrounds were actually all taped up and closed back in April. And I want to do a little bit more with the roller skating image in particular. If we think about roller skates, right, there's nothing new about children strapping on roller skates. And if some of us can remember back to when we might have put on a pair of roller skates, right, there's a real thrill and a sense of accomplishment if you can stay up on your roller skates. There's definitely a sense of risk taking, right, because it's kind of inevitable that you're probably going to fall as you figure out how to use the roller skates. It's a very old-fashioned way of playing, right, and enjoying oneself. And in some ways, just doesn't change, right? The roller skates might look a little different than when we were younger. They're more roller blades now than roller skates, right? But it's an old-fashioned kind of way of playing while moving forward. Roller skating over a speed bump, right, brings this extra layer of curiosity and risk-taking. There's a decision, right, to embrace this bump in the terrain rather than sticking to the very safe and flat sidewalk. So how do we bring that to legal education, that picture? Well, I want to suggest that just the fact that teaching and learning kind of went online, that we had to teach at a distance, that it wasn't the online mode itself that taught us how to be creative or how to take risks. But it did provide this kind of new opportunity, if we wanted to take it up, to sharpen our curiosity and revisit elements of play in our pedagogy. So I've suggested doing that a little bit with my Harry Potter idea. I think it was interesting. I found it interesting to watch the doctoral students in my legal education seminar in the spring do exactly that, right? Like kind of welcome this opportunity to use the new equipment, but not to do anything radically different than what they were going to do in the last session of the seminar, which was all about graduate level legal education and the kinds of pieces in graduate level legal education that are the most supportive. So, for example, right, peer-to-peer evaluation, the ability to narrate one's own journey through a thesis and one's ideas. But they were willing to bring a certain playfulness to this self-awareness as they adjusted their delivery of the last session of the course. So let me again quote from one of my colleagues, this colleague from Saskatchewan. There may be reasons to return to traditional approaches like the roller skates in pedagogy in this environment. Perhaps, surprisingly, some very traditional pedagogical approaches may be suited to the most contemporary times. Some of these approaches have worked across a wide range of circumstances in the past. The use of a Socratic method, so long as it is done in a way that is respectful of students, can support strong student engagement. Oxford-style tutorials are resource-intensive, but they are what is enabling Oxford to plan to continue teaching this fall with relatively few changes. I'll be interested to hear about that. While Canadian schools do not have the resources for large numbers of very small tutorial groups, the idea of asking students to engage with written material and then come to discuss what they have then written could actually be surprisingly well suited to current circumstances. Reading deeply is a great form of asynchronous learning, which I think is a great line, right? Lots of talk about asynchronous elements and recording capsules and kind of presentation mode and voiceover PowerPoints. And here's a reminder that reading, right, is a great form, probably the most familiar form for our students as well as us of asynchronous learning. So, right, the roller skate picture over the speed bump, I suppose, makes us think about how to hold on to what we would like to cherish about a chalkboard or about notes in the margins of our books, right? Penciled teaching outlines, new examples scribbled into the or put on little Post-it notes on our teaching materials with each year. That there are lots of these old-fashioned, right, modes of playing in pedagogy that indeed can be well adapted as we smooth down the speed bump. I'll just finish before I go on to my third and final stage. I'll finish with another quote from a colleague, this one from Western, who says, right, in normal times, the classroom is a foil for the stability and fixity and taken for grantedness of the world. When the world is certain, however pathological, the classroom is a place to disrupt our stock notions and habits. What about when the world is unraveling? Private worlds, social worlds, collective worlds, even the idea of a world, a fixity. What then is the classroom? Foil to what? Imagined communities, constructed communities, social network, curated space. What is this online classroom? Vessel for content delivery, a homeroom, a chat board, a canvas, a conversation? Was it ever possible that the law is a conversation, that learning is a conversation, that these two mysteries of human connection, law and education, reunite around this word, conversation, which we can still have even at a distance? Okay, so my third stage and my third, sorry, I need to do that. My third picture. So there we go. This is the third stage, life with a bright yellow speed bump, right? Completed transformation of the neighborhood. This is what the speed bump looks like today. And you can see actually behind me that the fluorescent yellow paint that was poured over the speed bump back in the spring is already fading. Right, the speed bump has become simply a fixed feature of the map and of our neighborhood reality. So my three words for this third stage: direction, recreation, and clarity. So direction. Why talk about direction? Well, because the speed bump in the street came along, was constructed, people played on it for a while, and then, right, the message was we can't get stuck on the speed bump, right? Whether looking at it or playing on it or even slowing down to get over it, you have to get over it. You just, right, it just means that you shift gears, but you keep going. The road opened up again. It's not a dead end. There are many possible destinations for the road users going over the actual speed bump. Now, it's been interesting to watch the different modes of drivers dealing with the speed bump. Some of them, without seeming to understand what the speed bump is actually about, speed up, right? They have figured out that if they go really fast over the speed bump, maybe it's kind of fun, and maybe, right, they don't actually kind of feel it at all. Others kind of stop, they stop when they see the yellow, and then they kind of creep over the speed bump little bit by little bit. And others, right, just slow down with deliberation. All of these are changes in behavior. Not all incorporate the purpose and the limits of this actual yellow speed bump. So how do we react to that? Well, I think with a commitment to what I would call recreation. And here I'm going to fill this out and my C word, clarity, over the next 10 minutes and then conclude. So, right, in legal education, we need to acknowledge the bright yellow speed bump. It can't be ignored. It's not really going away. It fades a little each day, right? The kind of the shock of the fluorescent yellow speed bump filling up our space isn't quite felt in that way anymore. It will fade in a sense with use. We're invited, if you like, if we take the speed bump a little more literally, we're invited to enjoy what I would call slow professor mode, right? We're not quite as busy as we were a few months ago, or at least we don't necessarily need to be. I think many of us are realizing the kind of hyperactive running to kind of keep up with whatever the latest video available at our institution or another institution about how to add another kind of way of polling our students or adding another embedding a video, etc. That busyness kind of we can't maintain that mode, right, day in, day out. That just as a driver would do on my street, right, we need to change gears, lower our speed, and perhaps notice the neighborhood in new ways without stopping. Right? We have to keep going. We have to then, right, think about where are we going together? Is there some shared direction or vocation, even if, of course, there is a necessary diversity of strategies and later turns and trajectories, right? But what can we do with the road we're on together? Uncertainty, after all, is nothing new. Indeed, uncertainty is absolutely core to legal education and any serious engagement with law and with communities and the governance of communities of human beings. And so this is why I think about recreation and perhaps resilience, although I think resilience is perhaps a kind of overused word these days, but recreation, picking up right, I talked in the first stage about feeling broken and sad. I don't think those broken pieces go away, right? But we pick them up, we find a place for them in our suitcase, right? And we hold on to them. They just become part of an ongoing journey. And so let me talk for the rest, right, about the C words that I want to put here in the third stage, and the C word is clarity, while acknowledging that clarity is not actually easy at this point, right, in late October 2020. The actual speed bump, right, in my street represents a very clear signal, right? Adjust how fast you're going, take into account what and who are around you as well as ahead, focus on location, and it really tells everybody who uses the road, right, what's expected from drivers as they pass through this neighborhood. You can see the painted, school children, right, in yellow on the street. It tells you this is a street with lots of kids, it's residential, there are schools, right? It's very clear. So can we look for some similar clarity for legal education? And I actually want to insist that another C word, campus, the actual campus, is a key C word in trying to figure out this clarity in describing life with the yellow pandemic speed bump as just part of our everyday background. Interestingly, I think law libraries were perhaps kind of model sites for innovation and continuity fairly early on, right? That the people who ran law libraries knew that their space, the space of the library, is crucial on a campus, crucial for our students in particular, many of whom do not have workspaces at home. And many people running the libraries did their utmost to make sure that they were taken into, that the university administrations did not forget about libraries. I also think law libraries, at least I noticed our law library at McGill really being a real model for all of us in terms of the innovation of getting curbside pickup service, right? So that we could continue to ask for books. They realized that the library was not just about the space and the desks, right? But about the content. And that might sound kind of old-fashioned, but people really needed books and they want books. And so I think that that's an interesting place actually to look for some encouraging, an encouraging example of an ability to combine what I've talked about as kind of holding on to something that's old-fashioned and we feel is core to legal education, for example, books, and then finding new ways to make sure that we don't kind of just jump into a new mode of teaching, learning, and research without those books. So here, I actually, along the same lines, but not about law libraries, but about public libraries in general, one of the law professors who wrote a little essay for my edited collection, who's out in Vancouver at University of British Columbia, talked in his essay about the important role played by libraries and librarians in both law and society, on what is lost when libraries close and what we should celebrate and fight for when they reopen. And I turn to this, and I'm going to just read a few of his sentences because I think actually it's a really nice model of clarity in terms of direction and recreation that for me, it kind of throws all of us in the legal academy a challenge as to whether we can articulate something similar about the importance of the campus and the clarity of this path we're on together as we move forward. So he writes, when libraries reopen, they will do so in the midst of an economic landscape that has been significantly altered by COVID-19. In the wake of this crisis, many individuals and families will need to make difficult decisions on where to spend their limited financial resources. In this environment, libraries, already critically important in so many ways, will take on an even greater importance in the lives of individuals and communities. Books and other works of expression provide lifelines to people, opportunities to escape, information to help build a better life, inspiration to take the next step. Now is the time for anyone who believes in the power of libraries to effect positive social change to do their part to ensure that despite whatever challenges emerge as a result of COVID-19, that libraries continue to be robustly supported. We need to think about how to ensure in an environment of limited resources that public libraries remain open and that they continue to serve as welcoming, vibrant, diverse, accessible, and safe spaces for all. So as I say, can we imagine substituting the word library for university campuses? So I know I will just take a couple minutes to conclude. Is that okay, Carl? Okay, so it is hard, of course, to be clear about the future of campus-based legal education. If you'll forgive me a little reference actually back to Harry Potter. Those of you who know Harry Potter will know that Professor Trelawney is the kind of a little less than impressive professor of divination, right? So that she actually gets the students to look at tea leaves and in crystal balls and try to predict the future, all of which is not particularly persuasive. We discover, though, that the beings in Harry Potter who actually do know something about predicting the future are the centaurs. Now, they don't, as it turns out, they don't predict the future in any kind of definite way. And instead, they look up at the stars and they look at directions and, how history has unraveled, and they suggest that there are movements up in the stars and that will perhaps take us in particular directions. So at the moment, right, you will all know that there are lots of people out there and reports and memos being written about how this, whatever the this is of today, is the future of legal education and of university education more generally. Right, on the basis of cost efficiency, flexibility, customization, right? If we looked at the tea leaves, right, we could imagine Professor Trelawney saying, I see interaction via screens, pre-prepared capsules, no needs for bricks and mortar, classrooms, corridors, conference centers. But instead, right, I wonder whether we should listen to the centaurs, who I would suggest will look back at history in order to prophesy the future and say, what do we see in legal education, or what should we want to see? Well, interactive learning to appreciate and listen to all sides of issues, engagement with peers, professors, sources, practice in speaking, an emphasis on exploration, persuasive arguments, constant modification and testing of ideas, a combination of taking on of responsibility and power and a recognition of one's limits in law, so some humility. All of these things, right, don't sound at all like they're about technology. Although I think that centaurs might say that if technology is involved, it'll be a more immersive technology, right? Way beyond what we can do with Zoom, but actually what some people who are really at the forefront of technology are experimenting with in terms of games, right? Gaming and immersive technology that actually incorporates this interaction. And so I think, right, this isn't the moment for clairvoyance, right? Looking in a crystal ball and specifying what is ahead for all of us. But perhaps the pandemic as a yellow speed bump, right, becomes a yellow backdrop, a reminder or a context that invites us to ask some key questions. What is it we long for? What is it we don't want to return to, right? Including a fraying of collegial governance structures, or right, the mistake that is often made between the delivery of information and the development of knowledge. Those are things that we don't want to return to. That is, we shouldn't be thinking about recovery post-pandemic, but rather reimagination. What will we do with our shared space when we get it back? Can we return to or do more with the promise of junior common rooms, middle common rooms, senior common rooms, many of which have been lost in law faculties? What is hard and challenging, even sometimes dangerous, but still worthwhile about teaching and learning together? There's been a lot of talk over the last few months about the ease, right? The advantages of remote teaching and learning. From the mundane, right? We don't have to worry so much about what to wear in front of our students, to, right? I don't have to worry about a commute, to the more serious, right? It's hard for students to move to new countries to take on education. It's hard to confront classmates face to face who disagree. Those are things are hard. But that doesn't mean that we should try to get rid of them. Instead, we may be challenged to redefine risk-taking and difficulty within the campus, within the classroom, and recognize that that kind of risk-taking is part of becoming a creative, resourceful, and confident jurist. And I'll just finish with two questions that I think we all need to ask ourselves, right? How is my own faculty or institution unique? Right? What is it about the community that I miss, or that I would commit to building when we go back to a shared space? And a more personal question, right? How do I, or have I, or can I make the classroom experience or supervision, and of graduate students really worth coming to campus for? What do I do in my teaching and supervision that really takes advantage of the fact that people, human beings, are sharing space? So I don't have the answers to those questions. In teaching tort law, those of you who remember tort law or teach tort law, the concept of remoteness, right, is one of the most difficult to articulate. And I think it's similarly difficult in the context of remote teaching and learning. It's difficult but crucial to take on the challenge of explaining why meaningful human contact or proximity as opposed to remoteness is so valuable in legal education. So I will stop there. I think I keep doing this with my students on Zoom as well. I say that I'll leave them, we'll finish early, and we never finish early. But anyway, I hope I'd be interested in hearing other examples from people, or to go back to any piece of the picture, and I'll leave the yellow speed bump behind me.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Shauna, for a fascinating, rich, multifaceted talk. I again would invite our audience members. You're welcome to contribute to the Q&A function. I want to start, though, and I obviously ask this of you as a tort lawyer, a couple of questions about proximity. And of course, we know from tort that proximity doesn't necessarily mean physical proximity at all. And it's a complicated notion. So the first part is to acknowledge that there are lots of experts out there who've long been engaged with, in genuine specialist distance learning institutions who have spent a lot of time thinking about presence and proximity in a distance learning environment. And it did seem to me, and I wasn't alone in this, that there was something, it occurred to me it must have been very frustrating at the time of lockdown to see all of these academics whose experience has been in a physical campus suddenly become experts overnight on distance learning. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, so that's yes. I think right from the beginning, mistakes were made by campus-based universities with complete kind of oblivion or disdain for high quality, right, online learning institutions and programs where people have put an incredible amount of time and energy into preparing, right, online entire programs, courses, etc. And so that the language that was being used and continues to be used, right, there's a real confusion, I think, when there's all this talk to, you're right, lots of amateur academics, right, to go to take on online learning and to also take on asynchronous learning. So that I think a lot of people, well, I know of some colleagues who just recorded themselves over the summer on different topics and then said, my teaching is done, right, for the fall. Because all I have to do is just tell the students that they can just watch me talk into a screen, right, or even listen. I created a podcast and I'm done. And so there are two things wrong with that, right? One, this idea that that's what quality online education would be, right? People who choose an online program and who deliver online programs will tell you that they require incredible investment of interactive, supportive time between teachers and students, right? That individual students will appreciate, for whatever reason, the asynchronous elements of online learning, but then they will require and, the support of the teacher in highly individualized formats that most university academics don't have time for and never anticipated. And so I think that and you're right that again, quality online learning is often invested in this feeling of presence and proximity, right? Bringing that to the experience such that the people who choose this for whatever reason, and often they're very good reasons, right, feel that they are indeed close to the material, close to the teacher, often close to their peers because they do a lot of small group work and have to find the time to do that. And I actually think as I'm setting out my ideas here, I actually think that there are, before the pandemic, my guess is that there are a whole lot of classrooms in many, many institutions that were not actually grounded in any meaningful presence or proximity, right? That basically what was going on in the classroom was easily replicable on screen and a repeat year after year, so that those same professors would be the ones who would think that they could just speak into something, right, record themselves, and then they'll just use those capsules for forever. And so I think that's the second mistake, is this idea that teaching is about teaching the stuff, right, the what, rather than the whom. Teaching and learning is always triadic in structure, if you like, right? The teacher teaches stuff to someone. The students learn the stuff from someone. And so that structure, that interaction should be happening, whether it's in a physical classroom or at a distance. And so I think that what I would call what campus university professors were asked to do, I would call that distance learning or distance teaching, rather than full online education. Institutions, right, and I think you're right, not only is it frustrating, but it's a little dismissive, right, for universities to sound as if everybody figured out within a couple of weeks how to do what people who are very serious pedagogues have developed in the online context.
Thank you. And another aspect, I think from what I've seen, there's often in universities and amongst university management, a lot of confusion about what they're trying to achieve. I think this is your point about not having thought things through. I mean, one example which I've heard about from a colleague in a law school here, who has a significant number of international students, actually international students who come from Canada for a graduate entry course, is that they asked before this academic year started, well, can we just stay in Canada? And her feeling was, she couldn't see why not, but the university was very clear that they had to come and register and have that physical presence for what was essentially an online, and in front of the screen experience. And I think there is this kind of real confusion and tension around presence and proximity that goes right through universities now.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I agree. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's some very strange messages, right? I think the universities are kind of skating on ice here. Like they're trying to convince people that it's worthwhile to come and then sometimes, right, making a particular rooms available for teaching and learning, but then telling the profs that they have to double up, right? They have to do the teaching in person to whoever can be there, but they also have to do teaching by Zoom, which creates a very, the teacher then is unable to create some cohesive dynamic for the classroom group because they're kind of expected to respond to very different expectations and needs, often fed by the university. I think that's right.
We have a question from our audience, from Professor Nigel Duncan. It's a comment and a question. He writes, in order to answer your final question, I suggest we need to observe and analyze what works well and doesn't work well in our online activities with students. Only then can we judge what we need to achieve in order to make coming into campus worthwhile. Have you any suggestions as to how we might collaborate in that observation and analysis so that we can pool our experience rather than just working on our own anecdotal experience?
I think it's a huge challenge, partly because the time when we should do this, right, let's say in the spring of 2021, right, it would be ideal to see the kind of time and energy that was put into scrambling to make sure everybody knew which buttons to click to use which platforms. If we held onto that and a few months from now did exactly what's being suggested, that is, share our experiences about what worked, why it worked, right? Why we could, for example, imagine and empathize with the student experience. I'll give it, in trying to read materials online while taking notes on a computer and watching Zoom, right? For those of us who for some reason couldn't imagine how difficult that would be for students, people didn't plan for that, right? But then found out as they started teaching that students said, well, it's very hard if you are talking about page whatever, if we can't keep switching back and forth. We only have one computer. How are we supposed to take notes while we're looking at up something and watching you? That's just sharing ideas about how teachers and students figured out how to deal with that. I've chosen a very mundane sounding example. Right? Will be absolutely crucial. Why? Because most of those questions and sharing of experience will be relevant to actual classrooms. But we actually don't stop and take the time collectively in our institutions on a regular basis to share ideas about pedagogical approaches that are working, ways in which we feel that we are succeeding, right, at our kind of best understanding of what meaningful legal education is. So I think there's an opportunity here. I worry very much that we'll kind of miss the opportunity, that instead of thinking about directions forward, we're in a kind of mode of just holding our breath until it's over. And then the risk is that we go back to what? What are we recovering, right? If we just go back to how things were before without using this learning, I guess I would say, right, there's this opportunity to paint legal education yellow, right? And then to think, what will it feel like if it's all yellow? Or what could we do together? So I suppose my advice would be in your own institutions to try to suggest that these kind of ad hoc, remote pedagogy committees kind of be replaced at some point with ad hoc kind of planning for or learning from the pandemic experience in terms of supporting our teaching. and diverting resources to support our teaching.
I think that's, and also I would suggest collaboration across institutions.
Yes.
As well.
Yes, for sure, because that also really struck me, that a lot of the work that was done in this spring, anyway, in Canada, I'm not sure kind of when the equivalent was happening in the UK, but was, repeat work, institution to institution. So people weren't sharing and weren't actually taking advantage of the very thing that this distance, right, this distance mode allows us to take advantage of, which is to hear from each other across institutions and to feel like to really take advantage of the fact that we can feel close to each other without having to take a plane or to just kind of depend on having actual physical crossing of paths, if you like, between colleagues.
You paint a very and I think we all felt this sense in some moments, especially this spring, around collective courage, community. In this country, we had clap for carers, clap for the NHS, clap for carers once a week. These moments of community. It does feel to me, though, and I think that was probably the case within institutions as well. I worry that it feels that moment has passed as we enter, certainly in Europe, are really the prospect of a very depressing winter. We have a distrust of management, university managerialism, certainly in this country, that's as deep as I've in my career have ever seen it. There's also just a distrust generally within society of that counters that community courage of who's breaking the rules, the reporting of people. So there's a real tension there, and I think the other thing that certainly has always been there within law schools and universities are the structural inequalities, but which have seem to have been exacerbated and laid bare by the pandemic. And I think especially around care and caregiving, which, I know from your own work, our own conversations, there's obviously been a long history of a gendered inequality around caregiving both caregiving towards students, but also having care responsibilities at home. And those inequalities seem to have just been so exaggerated over the past few months that I think that must also be a tension around and within institutions that will last, that won't be forgotten. I hope it's not forgotten.
Yeah. No, yes, I think that's right. It's difficult, right, I think we are in a moment of flux, though, on how we respond to the situations of colleagues who talk about the difficulties of, caring for children or caring for elderly parents at the same time that they're trying to care for students and care for their own research and, kind of manage all of this. And I guess I would say that for some of us, there's a risk of a little bit of cynicism here, right? Because some of us have lived years of our careers doing lots and lots of caring while also, right, doing all the pieces of our job that needed to be done. And perhaps wrote about how that was invisible, but didn't kind of expect concrete. I think what I mean by being in a period of flux is that I think we have not worked out how the university is supposed to respond to these different realities for employees, for example, or for students. Because, and this is what I mean by unpacking and continuing to pay attention to these arguments about what's difficult, and whether some of those difficulties are part and parcel of what people expect when, for example, they go to university and at the same time they're holding down a job because they have to, and they're helping look after a grandmother who's living with the family. That's always been the case. Now, what does that mean in terms of recognizing it? I think that's where there's some work to do. And we have to go beyond we have, student support services or mental health services or mindfulness programs, all of which may well help, but that's not exactly what I think you're getting at, Carl, in terms of those structural questions that always existed, but that may require particular attention.
Yeah.
But as I say, I think some of this is just kind of being articulated, because of the pandemic, but it's not that it didn't exist beforehand, right? Yeah.
I wanted to just comment on your discussion about taking risks and the way that's constructed in certain contexts, and certainly within UK higher education, that was particularly apparent around assessment exams.
Yes.
This past year. And I should say that I think UK higher education has tended to be quite, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there has been a lot of conservatism around exams and assessment. And of course, the pandemic forced change. That I know many people here have been advocating for a generation, as long as I've been teaching, and it was interesting to see how this change, which many would have predicted, might have constructed as this risk about what might happen, and of course the reality is nothing happened. That was so terrible. And exam boards happened remotely, and some students did, and surprise, some students did well, and some students did less well. Yeah. Maybe different students were somewhat differently placed on that spectrum, but there was still a spectrum of some kind. So it was interesting how what was constructed as a risk, and which also certainly here the regulators of legal education saw as risk. Actually, it just shows there was not this risk, that this fear, this lack of trust that had been painted previously.
Right. So I think that example just underscores the way in which a lot of assumptions that were made at and played out often in governance decision making without actually kind of stopping to pay attention to either input from participants or to kind of question the assumptions. I think across Canada, what happened, we don't have the exam boards in the same way. I don't think that was the concern so much, but there was many schools adopted different forms of evaluation of the exams at the end of the school year within law faculties. And so some law faculties imposed a pass-fail grading scheme or non-grading scheme on everyone. Some allowed students, after they received their grades, to substitute a pass or a fail. I think what was missing in a lot of that decision-making was input from not only professors, but also students. There was this sense, I alluded to it before, of kind of this is emergency decision-making. We just have to kind of go very quickly and decide what we think is best for the students. And I actually chaired our examination and evaluation committee in the spring. I had chaired it for a number of years. And at McGill, we insisted that all profs actually grade the work, but then students could choose if they wanted to substitute a pass or fail. And what we discovered is a little bit like what you just said. Basically, the grades looked like they always looked. Students did the work. What we did insist on and was meaningful feedback to the students. And this, of course, was something that we've been, again, a little bit like what you were saying, something that's been talked about for years. And we realize that that's good pedagogical practice to actually give constructive comments to students on their final exams and papers. But we have not been so good about it in practice. So again, that's something that I actually hope will go forward. That emphasis on feedback rather than on a particular grade.
We have a comment that's come in just to follow up on the point about collaboration, to mention a fortnightly workshop online that on legal education that is run by the Law Teacher Journal here. I will ask Dali to send it out to all participants tonight, just to share a forum where some of these conversations are going on, so that those conversations can be enriched by if participants want to join in. I would be remiss not to make a shameless plug with respect to your comment about libraries, because as the director of the Institute, which is probably best known for its library collection, I would have to say I was astounded by the creativity of our librarians, who had obviously done a lot of thinking over the years about space, physical space, proximity, the purpose of libraries, and who seemed to be able to very quickly think about how they could serve our membership remotely. Yep. Which actually, we had a huge spike in members because of that remote service to academics around the world could get reference support from a librarian online through a chat function, and who are now we have, much like you described, we then moved to a click, collect, and return service because we also have books that aren't in electronic form, and now opening our reading rooms in a socially distanced fashion. And I think what we're doing is just kind of monitoring how people are now using libraries and trying to respond. So I think there is this ongoing reflection now about exactly what is the combination of physical space and proximity that a library can serve.
Right. Well, it seems to me that, so I'm glad that your experience kind of supports my sense about this modeling behavior by the libraries. Perhaps it's not surprising at all, right? If you're like is focused on libraries, then you've been thinking about the risks, if you like, of everything going online for a long time, right? So being a serious, reflexive, librarian with an eye to the past and a good sense of what's going on now and looking to the future, that, it doesn't surprise me that librarians were not only equipped with the kind of ideas and energy and techniques, right, to deal with this, but also able to articulate so clearly in a way that, strangely, campus-based universities don't seem to be so able to articulate what was absolutely essential about them, about libraries. And so I think there's a moment, for libraries to shine and to continue shining. And I hope people will take seriously kind of looking to them as models for working out that articulation of what we want to recover and rebuild and reimagine when we kind of are past this pandemic, or at least have shifted the pandemic into kind of our background noise rather than kind of constant blockage, if you like, in our paths.
Well, Shauna, our time has elapsed, and it's gone incredibly quickly. And but I did want to take the time to thank you for joining us today for a fascinating and engaging presentation. A huge. I still do write on a piece of paper, so I've got loads of notes that I wrote.
Very good.
Thank you as well to our audience for joining us and for your participation. I should also say, finally, we have a very busy schedule of online events at the Institute throughout this academic year. So please do look at our website for our full schedule. And I hope that you will join us again soon. So until then, it's goodbye from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Goodbye.